It's obviously particularly a great pleasure for me to be part of the programme linked to the excellent This Girl Did, Dorothy Wordsworth and Mountaineering exhibition, which is on display downstairs, which I'm sure many of you will already have seen and enjoyed. As Jeff mentioned, the exhibition commemorates one of the great mountain climbs undertaken by women in the Romantic period, that of Scafell Pike in 1818 by Dorothy Wordsworth and Mary Barker, supported by their guide, the statesman Shepherd of the Vale, another man to carry our provisions, and Agnes the Maid. And I'm sure many of you will now also have seen the Wordsworth Trust's fantastic film that celebrates both that ascent and then a rewalking, the film called Journeywoman, featuring Alex Jacob Whitworth, that premiered at the Kendal Mountain Festival 3 weeks ago and is now available on YouTube. I'm not going to look in detail at Dorothy's ascent today. Dr. Joanna Taylor, who co-curated the exhibition with the Trust, has already given a fascinating lecture on Dorothy as walker and mountaineer as part of a series of events inspired by the exhibition. And that's also available on YouTube if you haven't seen it. And I think this will too be available on YouTube, won't it?
Next week.
Yeah. So what I want to do instead is to widen the focus to look more generally at women's role in the invention of mountaineering in the Romantic period. So as Jeff mentioned, the research project I'm working on at the moment makes the argument that it was during the Romantic period, which for the purposes of the study I'm dating as 1770 to 1836, that mountaineering in Britain was invented. It was, of course, a Romantic poet, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who made the first recorded use of the word mountaineering when describing in a letter to Robert Southey his 8-day circumcursion of the Lake District. Most accounts of mountaineering history and literature tend to focus on either the Alps or the Victorian period. But the overall argument of my work is that in Britain, it's during the Romantic period that climbing mountains became a popular leisure pursuit, to the extent that by the 1830s, people are already beginning to complain that mountain summits are becoming too crowded to be properly appreciated. So as active climbers of the hills, to adopt Dorothy Wordsworth's description of Mary Barker, women played an important role in this Romantic period development of mountaineering in Britain. While their mountain experiences were undoubtedly shaped by the social expectations placed on them as women, many of them challenged these expectations through their activities in the mountains, achieving some notable feats and making some uncommon performances to adapt two phrases from Dorothy's great account of her Scafell Pike climb. So let me begin by introducing one would-be woman mountaineer of the Romantic period, Miss Veronica Becker-Bunger, the fictional heroine of James Plumtree's satire of picturesque tourism of 1798, called The Lakers. Plumtree opens one scene of his Keswick-based comic opera with the following stage direction. Enter Veronica, her hair partly done up in a silk net, partly hanging loose, a straw hat and green veil, her gown fantastically drawn up. Veronica, the opera's heroine, is dressed for a ride up Skiddaw, her clothing and particularly her green veil modelled on that of alpine mountaineers. She also plans to take her Scottish plaid to have thrown round her when the air becomes very thin, because a riding habit would not have done at all in that mountain region. So you've sort of been reading alpine accounts of mountaineering where the air becomes very thin. It's not that thin that's off Skiddaw. When Veronica learns from the botanist Sir Charles that bad weather will prevent their planned excursion, she declares herself infinitely distressed, quite in despair. So Sir Charles argues that Skiddaw has got his nightcap on, madam, and were we to go up, we could not see anything of the surrounding country. So Sir Charles's argument here illustrates the principal motivation for the majority of ascents in the period, which was to get the view from the summit. You know, for climbers of the time, that was an extraordinary and unprecedented visual experience. But Veronica refuses to be fully swayed by Sir Charles's argument, replying determinedly, "Well, I'll wait till tomorrow morning, then I must go up whether it is fine or not. My tour would be absolutely incomplete without an account of a ride up Skiddaw." That Plumtree, the author of this work, could produce a heroine like Veronica as early as 1798 indicates that the figure of a woman keen to ascend to a summit was already a recognisable type, well known enough to be satirised. Plumtree's heroine is at least partly inspired by Anne Radcliffe's well-known and highly influential account of her 1794 ride up Skiddaw in her Observations during a Tour to the Lakes, which was published in 1795. However, Veronica can also be seen more generally as representative of the many women who climbed mountains in the Romantic period, both on horseback and on foot. Plumtree suggests that ascending mountains, like the elaborate costume in which Veronica plans to go up Skiddaw, has become the fashion. Women participated actively in climbing British mountains in the period, as is indicated by the figure of Veronica, with her anxiety that her tour would be incomplete without an account of a ride up Skiddaw. The majority of women's ascents of British mountains, like those made by men, were made as part of what is now usually termed the domestic or home tour, the increasingly popular trip around the sublime or picturesque regions of Great Britain, particularly the Lake District, Snowdonia and the Highlands of Scotland. For women as well as men, the majority of ascents were focused on the three key peaks, one in each of these regions, Skiddaw, Snowdon and Ben Lomond. The period did also see the development of active climbers of the hills who were resident in mountainous areas, such as Dorothy Wordsworth and Mary Barker, and of women who fit both these categories. So the remarkable Elizabeth Smith, to whom I'll return later, made an ascent of Snowdon while a tourist in 1798, before performing some impressive climbs with her sisters in the Lake District, where they'd become resident in 1801. For some women climbers, mountain ascent proved as meaningful as Veronica hoped it would be. For example, the National Library of Wales holds a manuscript account of an ascent of Snowdon written as early as 1775, in which the anonymous author, possibly Elizabeth Cust, climbed Wales's highest mountain in a party that also included at least two other women. The writer presents herself just as eager to ascend as the fictional Veronica, describing how, "The evening being very fine, I grew very impatient to fix upon the manner and time to ascend Snowdon." So she wants to go up in the evening, as was sort of the habit, so that you could see the sunrise when you're at the top, about 4 o'clock in the morning. "I was desirous to set out at 12 o'clock at night, but it was determined to take the more prudent way and not go till 8 in the morning. Before we could get our guide and horses ready, it was half past 9. It was an exceeding fine morning, and we set off in high spirits." So here, the writer conveys a strong sense of her eagerness to go up, emphasising her impatience and her desire to make the nighttime ascent that would enable the party to see the sunrise from the summit. Notably, this hoped-for plan is quashed by what is suggested are more cautious members of the party. It was determined to take the more prudent way and not to go till 8 in the morning, though a strong sense of excitement remains with the party setting off in high spirits. Unlike Veronica, this woman did make it to the summit, having left her horse at the first pinfold and walked across many loose stones, which, she says, hurt my feet so much. The very laborious undertaking was more than rewarded by reaching the summit, however, with the writer declaring that "it was the most glorious day I ever spent," and adding that should I ever have the happiness to come again to Carnarvon and the weather very fine, I should certainly attempt it again. So for this woman writer, reaching Snowdon's summit represents both the literal and figurative high point of her life. As these examples indicate, ascending Skiddaw in the Lake District and Snowdon in Wales had become a well-established pursuit for women on the tour by the end of the 18th century. In Scotland, the major target for tourists was Ben Lomond, and as early as 1787, Thomas Wilkinson encountered on that mountain summit what he described as a genteel company consisting of 12 persons, 6 of either sex, 2 guides, a black servant, and a pony with provisions. So you start to get some sense of the scale of the parties that are going up at this, even in this period. Even though the more daunting Ben Nevis was less frequently climbed, by at least the first decade of the 19th century, women would appear to have reached Britain's highest point, if an anecdote from Sarah Murray about Ben Nevis is to be believed. Murray did not herself climb the peak, writing in the 1810 edition of her companion and useful guide to the beauties of Scotland that, quote, "There are but few who attain so high a station, it being a very laborious journey to climb that mountain to the top." However, Murray offers an account of one woman who reached the summit as follows. "A lady of fashion, having conquered that ascent, before she quitted it, left on purpose a bottle of whisky on the summit. When she returned to the Fort William, she laughingly mentioned that circumstance before some Highland men as a piece of carelessness, one of whom slipped away and mounted to the pinnacle of 4,370 feet above the level of the fort to gain the prize of a bottle of whisky and brought it down in triumph." So she offers this anecdote as an illustration of Scots men's love of whisky, but actually, obviously, it's a very interesting piece in terms of mountaineering history. Murray is notably early in making use of the word conquered to describe a successful ascent, and her application of it to a climb made by a lady of fashion calls into question the frequent presentation of mountaineering as a masculine pursuit, in which the male climber conquers feminised nature in the form of the mountain. By contrast, Murray's anecdote represents a woman writer and adventurer celebrating a lady of fashion who's conquered the ascent of the highest mountain in Great Britain and used the opportunity to set up a prank at the expense of a local male mountaineer, the Highland man. The anecdote shows how climbing could call into question hierarchies of gender. It also perhaps serves to reinforce those of region and class in this case. As most of the examples already given would suggest, women made the majority of their ascents of British mountains as part of larger groups, usually consisting of either sex, to use Wilkinson's phrase, often guided and sometimes supported by further servants carrying provisions and clothing. An anonymous woman who climbed Snowdon on consecutive days at some point prior to 1821, so she enjoys it so much on the first day that she does it again with a different set of people on the second day, provides valuable insights into the group-based nature of ascents, writing that the late learned, worthy and much respected Councillor Dancy was one of the party, and several ladies and gentlemen. She then instructs her friend, "You may conceive a group, for we found other parties on the summit of apparently aerial beings standing on an elevated peak, literally above the clouds." As this account illustrates, the experience of standing above the clouds on an elevated peak was usually gained by both men and women as part of a group, rather than something exclusive to the solitary male figures with which Romantic period mountaineering is normally associated, such as Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Mist. So just as a little aside, as kind of visual aside here, I just want to contrast, this is probably the most famous painting of a Romantic period mountaineer, Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Mist. Painted, it's thought in 1818, so a very interesting year for mountaineering history. We've got this painting, we've got Dorothy going up Scafell Pike, we've got John Keats climbing Ben Nevis, all in 1818. And so this you will often see on the front of textbooks of Romanticism, and it's often related to things like Byron's Manfred or Wordsworth on Snowdon, for example. These kind of key moments which are sort of celebrated as representative what mountaineering in the period looks like. What I just want to juxtapose that with is a couple of paintings by a Scottish painter called John Knox, and his paintings of Ben Lomond and Loch Lomond from the 1830s. This one is looking north, and I'm not sure how clear it'll be to you. I've got a close-up in a minute, which you've already seen, but on the left-hand side and then on the right-hand side, you can see we've actually got groups of people on the mountains there. If we look at the next one down, you can see there again we've got a group. There's at least 3 groups on the left-hand side and more over on the right of people on the mountains. And then obviously, in terms of the context of this lecture, this is a particularly interesting close-up, because not only do we have the top-hatted men down on the right-hand side pointing to something, we've got the couple on the left-hand side, including a woman in a dress with her bonnet put to the side there. So very, very different version of mountaineering culture in the Romantic period from the one that we normally see, I think. Obviously an idealisation itself, but I think gives much more of a sense of what being in the mountains was like in this period. Many women ascended mountains alongside family members, including mothers, aunts and sisters, as well as husbands, fathers, uncles and brothers. Indeed, by the turn of the century, they were even being encouraged to ascend with their children. In a family tour through the British Empire of 1804, Priscilla Wakefield presents the ascents of mighty Skiddaw and some of the other smaller British peaks as suitable, enjoyable and educational experiences for the whole family. And she illustrates this with a narrative describing the ride up made by the widow Mrs. Middleton and her 4 children, the oldest of whom is 14, so the rest are younger than 14. A number of women did climb the British mountains as part of all women groups, almost always with a guide, or more extraordinarily on their own. So again, the remarkable Elizabeth Smith, biblical scholar and translator, who had become one of the most impressive women scramblers of the age, set out to climb Snowdon in 1798 with her mother and aunt, accompanied by a guide. When Smith's aunt became frightened, that's Smith's word, frightened, her mother stayed with her and very kindly insisted on Elizabeth proceeding with the guide. So she and the guide continued to the summit. Like Smith's party of female relatives, when groups or pairs of women ventured up mountains, they nearly always did so with a male guide, as was the case with Dorothy Wordsworth's and Mary Barker's ascent of Scafell Pike in 1818, and the climbs of Snowdon made in 1822 by Anne Lister with her aunt and Anne Atherton with a woman friend in 1825. However, during the period there were some instances of groups of women climbing unaided or aspiring to do so. In the Highlands and Western Isles of Scotland, which covers the decade prior to 1822, John McCulloch reports that as he was preparing to ascend Ben Lomond, quote, "I met 2 young ladies descending who had most courageously performed this feat unattended." In a letter of the 25th of June 1817, in which she recounts one of her own ascents of Helvellyn, Dorothy Wordsworth also describes how, quote, "the Miss Askews were eager in their hopes of ascending Helvellyn with Mary Ann and I think Miss Hazel." So Dorothy Wordsworth offers a fascinating glimpse here of a group of young women preparing to climb the local peak, and gives no suggestion that such an expedition was in any way inappropriate. One remarkable woman walker and climber who felt no need for a guide was the Lancashire governess and accomplished walker Ellen Wheaton, who ascended Snowdon unaccompanied in May 1825. And I'm going to turn to look at her in a bit more detail shortly. Excuse me. In addition to all these examples of women reaching mountain summits during the Romantic era, the period's literature also makes reference to a number of feats of daring performed by women. Sarah Murray, herself a notable scrambler, who made the first known ascent of Cairngorm by a woman in 1801, describes one descent route on the sharp and rocky ridge of Honister Crag in the Lake District as somewhat tremendous, though adds that it was descended in 1796 by a female. Similarly, William Green warns his readers against trying to reach the Lake District peak Waller Crag Pike, writing that this point is not to be reached unless by those possessing the temerity of the Derwent Water female, who at an alarming crisis is said to have scrambled up the shivering gully called Lady's Rake. A final example, William Bingley, in his tour round North Wales, describes how the potentially fatal leap made by his companion Peter Williams on the top of Tryfan, between the two summit blocks known as Adam and Eve, was inspired by another daring woman. As Bingley reports, Williams, quote, informed me that a female of an adjacent parish was celebrated for having often performed this daring leap. And when he was standing on one of the stones, dangerous as it was, he was determined to attempt the same. I don't know if anyone's ever tried to do that. Has anyone tried to do it? It's quite scary. I haven't done it. I've stood on the rocks but not made the leap. So a very interesting bit of daring there from that female of the parish. So as this survey shows, women were indeed active climbers of the hills and mountains of Britain in the Romantic period, performing some notable, even legendary ascents and feats of daring. However, their activities in the mountain were often shaped by the period's social conventions about what was appropriate for women, which frequently influenced which mountains they climbed and how they climbed them. A number of the period's most notable climbers write illuminatingly about being a woman on the mountains, though in their accounts they range from articulating pride at what they achieve to expressing hope that they won't be noticed. Sarah Murray repeatedly emphasises how daring she is for a woman, that's her phrase. For example, during a scramble down a steep and slippery cliff to see the Falls of Fires in Scotland, she describes it as a bold adventure for a woman, and takes pleasure at the disconcerting effect she has on the men she encounters there. On my return from the promontory, I met 4 travellers, males, not very active in body, who came tumbling and slipping down the banks with fright and dismay that made me smile. They stared at me as much to say, "How came you there?" So Murray, perhaps with a confidence stemming from her upper-class social status, clearly enjoys being a puzzle to these male spectators, her presence calling into question their assumptions about what women can do, and her agility and daring establishing a contrast with their own inelegant and fearful descent. Like Murray, the Lancashire teacher, governess and diarist, Ellen Wheaton, was aware that as an unaccompanied woman, she would cut an exceptional figure in the mountains. But unlike Murray, she sought to avoid notice where possible. Wheaton was a very impressive walker and climber who made several unaccompanied ascents of mountains in the Lake District, the Isle of Man and Wales. She explored the Lake District fells while working as a governess at Dove Nest, which is now the Sanling, near Ambleside, where she was from 1808 to 11, might be 12. On a later occasion, when viewing Skiddaw, Saddleback, Helvellyn, Coniston and several others, she exclaimed that, quote, "I felt a pleasure in looking at them, for there had my feet trodden and some of my happiest days been spent." During a 5-week holiday on the Isle of Man in 1811, Wheaton undertook a number of remarkable solo expeditions, describing them in a diary letter to her friend Anne Winkley. During one 30-mile unaccompanied walk, Wheaton climbed the Greeba mountain, choosing to ascend by the most direct but also challenging route. I might have ascended a much less difficult way, but this was nearer, and walls and rocks are slight impediments to me. On another unaccompanied walk, Wheaton ascended the island's highest peak, Snaefell, in dangerously windy conditions, but, quote, determined that the wind should not entirely conquer me, unquote, she crawled on her hands and knees to place a stone on the summit cairn. Wheaton had a stated preference for walking alone, so that, quote, my thoughts, as well as my feet, may ramble without restraint. It's a great phrase. But she was highly conscious of how unusual a figure she might appear to others, as both a mountaineer and an unaccompanied woman. She describes how a local girl she met when beginning the ascent of Greba expressed some surprise when I told her I'd been to the summit of the hill, causing Wheaton to reflect that I've missed this one. Causing Wheaton to reflect that it is no very common thing, I suppose, to see strangers go up the mountains, particularly a decently dressed female alone. Wheaton also describes how when descending Scafell, many of the local men cutting turf on the mountain, quote, ceased working and stood to gaze. The men did not insult Wheaton, as she fears they might, but their reaction prompts her to offer a fascinating portrait of her appearance as a woman mountaineer and the impression she feels she made on others. A lonely female, dressed as I was, I dare say they never saw in such a place, for I had on a small sluice straw hat, a grey stuff jacket and petticoat, a white net bag in one hand and a parasol in the other. And in their eyes, I dare say, I made a rather singular figure. For Wheaton, the pleasures of her embodied experience in mountainous terrain justified both the effort required and the stares she had to endure from others, as she stated in a passionate and eloquent defence of her mountaineering practice to Anne. There is a simple grandeur and beauty in such scenes that infuses a greater portion of enthusiasm within me than I can express. I admire, I wonder, I adore. Oh, Anne, if you knew the pleasure I feel in running wild among such scenery, you would not wonder at my temerity or at my undergoing so much fatigue to obtain the gratification. So for Wheaton, walking and ascending provided both visual and physical pleasure, offering the freedom of running wild in the mountains that was unobtainable within the confines of her role as governess. The tension between Wheaton's mountaineering achievements, on the one hand, and her considerable apprehensions about how she would be viewed by others, on the other, as an unaccompanied woman, are best illustrated by her account of her ascent of Snowdon, made in 1825. Wheaton had harboured a very wild scheme of an unaccompanied walking tour of Wales since 1809, planning, quote, to dress in the plainest garments I had, that I might attract less notice. At that time, in 1809, she dismissed the scheme, commenting, if I was a man, now, I could soon do it. But in 1825, she did make an ascent of Wales's highest peak as part of a 25-mile walk. Wheaton chose a route up the mountain some distance from the regular path in the hope of not being identified by others. On seeing a gentleman descending with his guide, she says, I deviated a little more, purposely, that they might not distinguish my dress or features, as I should dread the being pointed out in the road or street as, that is the lady I saw ascending Snowdon alone. So for a woman, Wheaton reveals, a reputation for having made an unaccompanied ascent is something to be dreaded. For the gentleman and his guide, in this anecdote, Wheaton is an incomprehensible figure. They can't understand what she's doing on the mountain. On seeing her, the guide shouts directions, which Wheaton first ignores. I was quite deaf, she says, but is eventually forced to hear. So she's, I think mansplaining is the modern term, isn't it? There's a lot of mansplaining to her here on the mountain. While Wheaton stresses, I knew the way perfectly well, for my map and my guide had been well studied at home, the two men can only account for her presence on the mountain by believing that she had looked for the guide at his dwelling hut, but finding him absent, had started the ascent in the hope of encountering him. So the men decide to part so that the guide can assist Wheaton, but she ignores this offer and continues the ascent alone. I never turned my face towards them, but walked as fast as I could, hanging down my head, the guide again giving me some directions. The extraordinary figures and achievements of Murray and Wheaton illustrate the potential constraints placed upon women climbers by social expectations about women's roles. Though both women refused to be limited by these constraints in pursuing their impressive climbing achievements, they responded very differently to them. While Murray delights in confounding gender expectations through her presence on the mountain, Wheaton shaped her climbing practices so as to try and attract less notice. Some male writers too showed an awareness of how the social conventions of gender could restrict women's movements in the mountain. The Ambleside-based painter, writer and mountain guide, William Green, regularly guided groups that included women around the Lake District mountains. And in his Tourist New Guide, which is 1819, he frequently praises their abilities, for example, describing the, quote, elegant females who, full of health and spirit, were wishful to practice descent on some challenging rocky terrain. In praising these particular women, Green makes the point that they refuse the assistance of men, contrasting their independence with others who accept what he terms the etiquette of the old school and are handed from crag to crag down the rugged steep. This comparison causes Green to reflect that, quote, an excess of outdoor ceremony tended and still tends to prevent the female from acquiring the proper use of her limbs and of learning to bound from rock to rock with the celerity of the fleecy ranges of the mountains. So in other words, it's social convention rather than any inherent qualities that place limits on women's abilities in the mountain. In the Tourist New Guide, Green particularly encourages women to explore the mountainous terrain of the Lake District. For example, in his section on Dungeon Gill, which as you'll know is in the Langdale Valley, he specifically reassures the fair one who, venturing to glance her beauteous eye upwards, will retreat with anxious trepidation, fearing the stone which spans the yawning chasm may tumble and destroy her. While Green's chivalric tone and figure of, there's one word, isn't it? Patronising, I suppose would be the other one. While Green's chivalric tone and figure of the anxious fair one might seem to reinforce some of the period's conventional representations of women as more delicate and fearful than men, his aim is to reassure his women readers that they can explore the sublime region. Gentle lady, fear it not, it will not harm either by falling on or with you. For should your head be equal to the task, the stone will support your steps from side to side. Green's address here to the potential woman mountaineer serves as an introduction to an account of being one of a party of 16 persons, including at least 5 women, who explored the Langdale Valley and ascended the steep route alongside Dungeon Gill to Stickle Tarn. In describing this mountain excursion, Green again praises the agility and courage of the women involved, writing that, quote, the fair mountaineers, descended to the bed of the river with a celerity and a careless ease that would have surprised a southern female. So Green's use of the term the fair mountaineers there refers primarily to the fact that the majority of women were from Ambleside and so were mountaineers in the sense of living in a mountainous region. So notably as fair mountaineers, the Ambleside women are defined not against men, but against other women, the females from the supposed flatlands of the south. While Green praises the ability of women in the mountains, his account of the Langdale excursion also indicates how the presence of women presented a challenge to many men in the period. He describes how the majority of this party began to make the ascent, leaving, quote, only the writer and one of the gentlemen, who, not being in the habit of climbing hills, was persuaded to stay a little longer, being assured that though among the last to leave the resting place, yet he would not be the last at the goal. This gentleman, however, is unsettled by the prospect of being beaten to the tarn by the women, and addresses the author saying, "Green, shall we let a parcel of women reach the lake before us?" While this gentleman rushes off in his eagerness to beat the women, Green climbs at a moderate pace, overtaking 3 of the women before finding his friend stretched at full length upon a stone. Green then reaches the tarn just as the prostrate gentleman's brother had arrived there with 2 of the ladies. So Green says that he offers this anecdote with the intention of showing the impolicy of beginning to climb mountains at full speed, but it's also highly revealing about the gender politics of climbing. While Green, as an experienced and fit guide, is able to leave later than any of the women, yet still arrive at the target at the same time as the foremost of them, his friend exhausts himself in his determination not to be beaten by a parcel of women. And for a number of male climbers and writers, the presence of women on the mountains was challenging because it potentially undermined their own sense of achievement, which they frequently registered in gendered terms. So you're a man, you think you're doing something very manly, and then a woman's got there quicker than you, and he's doing it better than you, so it undermines what you're doing, it's their anxiety. So as a result, one sort of trope in some period summit literature by men is that which emphasises women's failure or difficulties on the mountain, especially if they might seem to have outperformed their male companions. When William Hutton made an ascent to Snowdon in 1799, at the age of 76, he left his daughter, that's impressive, isn't it? Yeah, at the age of 76. He left his daughter Catherine at the base of the mountain. But he did offer an account of one woman's experience on the mountain in his Remarks upon North Wales of 1803. In this volume, he recounts how 2 gentlemen and a lady climbed Snowdon in September 1797 on a day that was so windy they were forced to hang on to each other to prevent themselves from being blown off when they get soaked in the rain. Hutton writes, "In this dreadful state they reached the top. The lady, elated with success, though she could see nothing, pulled off her hat and cap and huzzaed for joy. Returning, the wind took them both away. The guide told me he found the hat a year after by a pool in the Great Chasm and wore it himself." Hutton interprets this woman's summit celebration as symbolic of a broader threat to conventional gender hierarchies. Continuing as follows: "The Amazonian lady, no doubt, was the leader of the party and designed, like some of the others of her sex, to govern ours. The lofty Snowdon, however, reduced the lofty spirit of the female adventurer. She fell into fits, her life was despaired of, and she was brought in a chase the next morning to Carnarvon at 4 in a state of distress which excited pity." So for Hutton, the woman on the summit is unnatural and figures a wider menace to the social and political order. He is, of course, writing in the decade of Wollstonecraft's The Rights of Women. By reducing the Amazonian lady from her lofty summit position to a ground-level recipient of pity, Hutton's anecdote restores conventional gender roles and offers a warning to other female adventurers of the dangers of seeking elevation. There are poetic examples, too, of this reduction of women's mountain achievements. John Keats was proud of his own climbing exploits and linked them to his own literary vocation, presenting both poetry and mountaineering as dangerous, daring, and implicitly manly undertakings that required what he termed nerve if their respective summits were to be reached. When Keats climbed Skiddaw, for example, he wrote, "I felt as if I were going to a tournament," indicating how, for him, ascent was a means of proving manliness. Climbing Ben Nevis in 1818, the same year as Dorothy's climb of Scafell Pike, was particularly important for Keats but he was disconcerted to discover that a few years before his own ascent, I quote, there was one Mrs. Cameron of 50 years of age and the fattest woman in all Inverness who got up this mountain. Keats responded with a doggerel verse between Mrs. Cameron and Ben Nevis, which culminates with the woman fainting and having to be helped down the mountain by her affrighted servants, a reduction that parallels that inflicted by Hutton on the Amazonian lady. While Hutton's and Keats's writings offer individual instances that seek to reduce the lofty spirit of the female adventurer, to quote Hutton, on a more general level, much of the period's travel literature and travel practices sought increasingly to differentiate the way men and women climbed mountains and even the mountains that they climbed. And this differentiation of the mode of ascent was deemed suitable for the two sexes was particularly enacted through the use of horses. So I just want to have another quick sort of visual interlude here. So I don't know how clear that's going to be for you at the back. This is slightly later than the period we're looking at, a caricature from 1845, depicting, as it says, scenes of a mountain excursion. This is set on Ben Lomond. And as you can see, I just wanted to give that sense of how many of the ascents were made on horseback. So in the centre of the picture we have the woman on horseback climbing there. Then we have different modes of ascent. The two men are climbing up the side. There's another man who I think is being ridiculed because he's on horseback in the centre. And just a couple of details which are interesting. So here's the horses being brought to the inn at the start of the climb. And then I'll just go back to the first one, just up on the left, just behind the guide there, you'll see two figures coming up over the edge. Which is just quite interesting that one of those figures, you can see that these two figures scrambling over the edge, one of them is clearly a woman there who's scrambling. So hidden away in this picture of the women going up on horseback, we do have a little example of a woman scrambling up a ridge there. So in the late 18th century, horseback ascents of the major peaks were not uncommon for either men or women. For example, in his account of his 1773 climb of Snowdon, Thomas Pennant describes the point at which people usually quit their horses, while William Hutchinson, having ascended Skiddaw by foot, repeated the ascent in 1776, mounting the crown of Skiddaw on horseback, an undertaking not to be recommended, he said. When Anne Radcliffe rode up Skiddaw in 1794, she was in the company of her husband, who was also on horseback. Many of the early guidebooks advocated the use of horses for men and women, though like Hutchinson, a number of writers found horseback ascent much more uncomfortable than walking. When James Plumtree, the creator of Veronica, climbed Skiddaw in 1799, he commented, "I got onto one of the horses for a few paces to see what it was like. I was well pleased when I found myself on my legs again." Nevertheless, despite the discomfort of riding up mountains, horses became increasingly identified as a mode of transport suitable for women who would have ridden side saddle, as is the case, as you can probably just see on that earlier picture. You see the woman in the middle is riding side saddle. For example, William Green stated in 1819 that a lady of light weight may ride to the top of Skiddaw without alighting and descend it to the town in safety if in the steepest part someone manages the horse's head. Though he added, it is a relief to both the rider and the horse occasionally to dismount. The linking of women with horseback ascents limited the number of summits to which they could ascend and created a second set of peaks which were implicitly deemed more suitable for men. Edward Baines's A Companion to the Lakes of 1829 illustrates how the methods and location of ascent have become differentiated for men and women by the end of the Romantic period. Baines's volume is particularly interesting in this context in that it makes special claims for itself in relation to women and the mountains. Baines writes that ladies in particular will learn what enterprises they may safely attempt in the mountainous regions, and where they would be exposed to danger or excessive fatigue. In his topographical section, Baines comments that Skiddaw is not difficult of ascent. The distance from Keswick to the summit is 6 miles, and ladies may ride up on horseback, though not without considerable fatigue. In the volume's family tour section, Baines devotes a chapter to describing one such ascent, the expedition he himself had undertaken with his niece and nephew, Matilda and George, and their maid and aunt, Miss Annabella. He presents the planning of the ascent in terms that draw attention to the involvement of the 2 women members of the party. This expedition had been determined upon without much previous consultation with the ladies. As soon as it was mentioned, Mrs. Annabella declared herself eager to achieve the ascent of so celebrated a mountain, and Matilda, who knew very little about the matter, offered no objections. The latter, however, began to suspect that she was engaged in no light half-hour's trip when I advised her to put on her plainest and warmest clothing, an old bonnet and a pair of strong boots. Despite Matilda's increasing objections, which we are told are overruled, the expedition goes ahead with an emphasis on the different modes of ascent. 2 ponies were ordered to the door for the ladies. George and I were to walk at their sides for security. These differentiated modes of ascent become emphasised as the climb becomes more challenging, with, quote, the guide leading Mrs. Annabella's horse and George walking by her side to support her in her seat, while I render the same service to his sister. Baines presents the summit experience from the women's point of view. Matilda is described as nearly exhausted and sobbing out, "Oh, William, I would not do that again for the world." While Mrs. Annabella, who walked the last part of the ascent, was, quote, obliged to rest some minutes before she recovered herself so as to enjoy the astonishing prospect beneath us. The reaction to the view is also presented from the women's point of view. The ladies, though with disordered hair, blue noses and chattering teeth, declared that they were amply repaid for their exertions. Upon return to the hotel, the achievement of the climb is registered through its enduring value for the 2 women. The evening was not long enough to talk over our adventures, and Mrs. Annabella and Matilda have laid up a stock of glory which will last them their lives. A calmer day would have made their enterprise comparatively easy, but it would have deprived them of their after enjoyment, the exquisite delight of recollected hardship. So Baines's account works to present the ascent of Skiddaw as a suitable and rewarding climb for the ladies, confirming the value of the ascent for them as an achievement. However, for the narrator and George, it serves another purpose, because it offers a form of mountain ascent against which they can define the more challenging climb of Helvellyn that they undertake the following day. Baines writes that George and I had a strong inclination to ascend Helvellyn, which being somewhat higher than Skiddaw and more difficult of ascent, is much less frequently climbed by travellers. Neither for the ladies' sake nor for our own did we wish them to accompany us, and they were themselves of the opinion that they had done enough for glory in the ascent of Skiddaw without tempting the more perilous heights of Helvellyn. So the more perilous climb of Helvellyn is not only unsuitable for ladies, but is a means by which Baines and George can prove their own masculinity, choosing to ascend via the vertiginous ridge of Striding Edge for reasons Baines gives as follows: being incited by curiosity and quite as much by the motive which actuates most men in fighting duels, a fear lest our courage should be called into question if we declined the danger. By moving off the beaten track up Skiddaw and scrambling along the perilous ridge of Striding Edge on Helvellyn, Baines and his male companion assert their own masculinity, defining themselves against what has become a standard element of the domestic tour, the ascent to a popular mountain summit. an activity that will provide glory for the ladies, but no longer affords a proper test of courage for men. Baines's text gives some idea of the increasingly prescriptive and restrictive nature of much of the period's travel literature and many of its practices in relation to the issue of women in the mountains. However, as I've sought to emphasise in this talk, many women climbers did not limit themselves to the recommended peaks or to horseback ascent, and a number of male writers were capable of recognising and celebrating women's achievements on the mountains. There are several examples that could be looked at here, including William Wordsworth's poem To Blank, Miss Blackett, isn't it, on her first ascent to the summit of Helvellyn of 1816, which celebrates the achievement of an anonymous woman climber in reaching the peak that Baines would imply was not for lady climbers. However, I want to finish this talk by looking at Thomas Wilkinson's Tours to the British Mountains of 1824, which celebrates the Lake District mountain achievements of the Smith sisters, including Elizabeth, whose climb of Snowdon in 1798 I've already discussed. I'm sure the Smith sisters will be known to many of you. They've been resident in Coniston since 1801, living at Towson Ground, where Thomas Wilkinson, Wordsworth's friend, landscaped a garden for them. And Wilkinson describes two of the sisters' mountain adventures, which must have occurred before late 1805, which is when he lent the manuscript of his tours to William Wordsworth. The first of these adventures was a day's tour to the Langdale Pikes, as the chapter's titled, the mountainous region where Joseph Budworth had claimed to have made the first ascent by a stranger of Piker Stickle in 1797. So only, between 4 and 8 years before this, you've got the first stranger's ascent to Piker Stickle. And Wilkinson and Budworth had a guide. Wilkinson presents the party, so the party is himself and the three sisters, presents the party's expedition to this alpine mountain as a serious undertaking in an environment where the traveller is, quote, alarmed and bewildered. Wilkinson was himself an intrepid and pioneering ascender of summits, but throughout his account he emphasises the courage, good humour and skill of the three sisters, happy to acknowledge that in all these qualities they exceed him, as can be seen in the following passage. To these sublime and dreadful regions I ascended with my intrepid maids, and was the first to express any fear. Catherine, who feels a kindness for the whole creation, offered me her hand, while Elizabeth, with a courage I had never met with before, proposed to explore what remained, and winding round the corner of a rock, presently ascended out of sight. Comparing Wilkinson's description of the Smith sisters scrambling on Langdale Pikes with William Green's account of women in the Lake District discussed earlier, shows how Wilkinson is happy to place himself in the position normally occupied by women in the mountains, while the sisters take on the roles usually assumed by men. Green, you'll remember, had begun his account of being part of a mixed party exploring the Langdale Valley by reassuring his women readers, writing, gentle lady, fear it not. By contrast, Wilkinson admits that he was the first to express any fear. Similarly, Green had discussed the etiquette around men handing women from crag to crag. Yet in Wilkinson's narrative, it is one of the sisters, Catherine, who offers her hand to him for support. In Green's account, as guide, he's very much in charge of route finding, whereas it is Elizabeth who takes on the exploratory role for Wilkinson's party, and does so with a courage Wilkinson has never met with before. When, at the end of the account, Wilkinson comments that he had been planning the expedition for a decade, he remarks, "But who would ever have conceived that I should have been led on by such amiable conductors?" Placing the sisters in the role of conductors, Wilkinson grants them the status of the leaders of the expedition, reversing the conventional roles of men and women in the mountains. Wilkinson's willingness to acknowledge that the Smith sisters' skill and courage in the mountains could reverse conventional gender roles is seen even more clearly in his narrative of an ascent they made of a snow-covered Helvellyn, the same mountain that would be so manfully climbed by Baines and his nephew some 20 years later. Wilkinson describes how he had made an engagement with the three sisters to ascend this mountain, and they more than once reminded me of my promise. However, not liking the idea of encountering wreaths of snow and sheets of ice, Wilkinson reneged on his promise due to the mountain's danger. On next meeting the sisters, Wilkinson proceeded with pleasant anticipations of our mountain journey some sunny day, as the snows were now dissolving, only to learn that the sisters had undertaken the climb in his absence. They triumphantly replied that the week before they had shod their staffs with iron and made their journey without me. I now addressed them in the language of pity for cold fingers and toes. So he's sort of slightly trying that trick that Hutton did of pitying the women on the mountain at this point, even though they've got up and he hasn't. They ridiculed my effeminacy, so they're having none of it. They ridiculed my effeminacy, telling me that they had all three made the summit of Helvellyn without a guide, and that they were so delighted with their excursion that two of them repeated the journey the next day. Wilkinson's exchange with the Smith sisters explicitly invokes the language of gender. They ridiculed my effeminacy and shows how their mountaineering exploits and shows how through their mountaineering exploits they were able to overturn conventional expectations of gender roles. Unlike Baines, so keen to assert his own masculinity through juxtaposition with the women's ascent, Wilkinson is prepared to acknowledge not only the sisters' achievements, but also the fact that these achievements call into question the supposed manliness of both himself and other hardy males. He concludes, I now willingly relinquish the palm of hardihood to these intrepid maids, and it will not be likely to be regained by some of my degenerate countrymen whom I found not long after hunting with umbrellas in their hands. In presenting the palm of hardihood to these intrepid maids, Wilkinson here provides a fitting tribute to the Smith sisters that can be extended to the other intrepid women mountaineers of the Romantic period, to Anne Radcliffe, Mary Wheaton, Dorothy Wordsworth, Mary Barker, Agnes the Maid, Miss Blackett, Sarah Murray, Anne Lister, to the two young ladies descending Ben Lomond, met by John McCulloch, to the unknown women who scrambled down Honister Crag, up Ladies' Rake, and leapt from Adam to Eve on the summit of Tryfan, to William Green's Fair Mountaineers, to William Hutton's Amazonian Lady and John Keats's Mrs. Cameron, and to all the other women who were active climbers of the hills, including those whose climbing histories have since been lost. Of all these women, we might conclude by saying, to adapt the title of the current exhibition, these girls did. Thank you.